Mountain man Elias Hawthorne wanders the rugged frontier, haunted by the loss of his wife and daughter, in a savage ambush. When he spots a starving orphan girl wearing the exact silver bear pendant he forged for his missing child, his world crumbles. But the truth he uncovers about his wife's survival and hidden existence will shatter everything he held true. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. The mountain man, Elias, did not believe in spirits, but he saw one in the fog-shrouded paths of Frontier Hollow. It was not a wraith of the departed that halted the air in his chest, but the spectre of a recollection dangling from the slender neck of a famished child. There, against the ashen skin of a girl he had never encountered, was the one item that showed his life had not fully crumbled to embers, a single piece of silver, skillfully hammered into the form of a grizzly bear in mid-roar. The very same pendant he had crafted for his daughter Eliza, the day the wilderness claimed them. That day, several years past, had been one of gunfire and howling winds. When a band of outlaws swept down upon his remote cabin like a storm, they had stolen everything. His wife, Nora, a woman whose voice was the whisper of pine needles, and Eliza, his 7-year-old daughter, whose tiny grip was a ghostly pressure he still sensed in his calloused palm. Of his existence before, only 2 remnants endured, the perpetual frozen chill in his spirit, and an identical silver bear he wore under his buckskin shirt, a harsh solace against his weathered flesh. He had roamed the mountains since, not as a trapper chasing pelts, but as an emptied shell of a man rummaging through the snow and stone for a fragment of his shattered soul. Frontier Hollow was a mocking name for a settlement that appeared to be steadily fading. Its cabins leaned like weary travelers, their logs splintered and darkened by relentless blizzards that granted no pity, only trial. The ground itself was frozen and barren, echoing the expressions of the folks who claimed it as theirs. It was here, in the narrow shelter provided by the trading post's overhang, that destiny dealt its card. He noticed the girl first as a shadow of motion at the fringe of the central clearing. She was around 9 years old, with limbs as brittle as a fledgling deer's and hair the shade of faded bark. The other youngsters, sturdy and boisterous, kept their distance, their mutters like the bite of sharp thorns. She was a pariah, a child who spoke the tongue of starvation more fluently than she knew the warmth of a hearty stew. Her name, though he did not yet know it, was Amelia Brooks, the orphan of a prospector who had pursued fortune to the depths of a caved-in tunnel. But it wasn't her destitution that captured Elias's stare and imprisoned it. It was the abrupt flash of familiar gleam against her throat. The landscape shrank to that lone spark of metal. The far-off creak of a wagon wheel vanished. The bitter tang of pine sap on his tongue was overlooked. There was only the bear, its silver paws raised, charging through a terrain of unimaginable loss. It couldn't exist, and yet it did. The surge of hope that rushed through him was a fierce, agonizing force, a frost-bitten man's desperate grasp for warmth that sears the skin. It was chased quickly by an icy surge of dread. For years his pursuit had been a matter of vague conviction. Now it bore a visage, and that visage belonged to an unknown. He shoved away from the post, his steps measured, intentional, every skill sharpened by a lifetime of endurance, now centered on not alarming this delicate youth. But his mere existence was a disruption. In Frontier Hollow, a mountain man was not a person. He was a harbinger. The settlers halted, their talks fading in their mouths. A mother drew her young one near. The marshal, a stern-visaged man named Harlan Reed, adjusted his stance, his fingers wandering to settle on the scarred wooden handle of his pistol. The atmosphere thickened with a mistrust as ancient as the peaks. The youths dispersed like startled grouse as Elias narrowed the gap, his silhouette enveloping the girl. Amelia glanced up, her gaze broad with the instinctual terror of a trapped animal. He paused before her, a towering figure of a man, his countenance a veil of inquiries too profound for speech. He didn't utter a word. He merely lifted a hand, his digits quivering faintly, and indicated not the girl, but the shard of his essence she bore around her neck. He did not inquire where she obtained it. His eyes, shadowed with a grief that surpassed words, posed a much graver query. "Who are you?" A hush descended over the trail, the quiet of a realm suspending its exhale. And so the phantom commenced its stride, each footfall a span of mourning, advancing toward the girl who donned his pilfered history. He did not realize he was advancing toward a revelation far more ruinous than the one he had borne for years. The hush that extended in the muddy path was a breathing entity, weighty and keen with unvoiced queries. The settlers, immobilized in their routines, formed an array of toughened countenances. Their stares locked on the wordless interaction between the mountain man and the orphan girl. Marshal Reed's hand stayed a whisper from his firearm, a mute vow of force should the outsider err. But the antagonism in the breeze was not what shattered the enchantment. It was the groan of a hinge from the supply depot and the emergence of a woman whose features mapped trials and anguish. This was Beatrice Brooks, the aunt who had sheltered Amelia when she had no other refuge. She was an unadorned woman, her palms rough from lie and her garb bleached from endless scrubbings, but her gaze contained a fatigued wisdom. She beheld Elias, beheld the stark, unprotected agony in his look, and then she beheld the pendant he wore, the duplicate to the one on her niece's neck. A sigh fled her lips, a minor injured noise, and the hue ebbed from her face, rendering it as pallid as snow-drifted wood. It was not terror that gripped her, but an acknowledgement so deep it appeared to rattle the core of her existence. The settlement turned to her, intuiting that the solution to this enigma resided in her. Her tone, when she at last voiced it, was faint but distinct, slicing through the strain like a sliver of ice. She did not address the assembly or the marshal, but straight to Elias, as if they were the sole two beings in creation. She commenced a tale that muted every murmur and captivated every soul. She narrated of her brother Amelia's father, a decent fellow whose fortune had always been as sparse as his pouch. Several years prior, while trapping in the highlands, he had discovered a woman at the rim of a frozen ravine, feverish and close to demise, her recollections scorched away by cold and ordeal. She was a wanderer, that much was evident, but she recalled no identity, no background, no kin. All she possessed was the pendant she grasped in her fist, the one with the silver bear. He had carried her back, tended her to recovery, and in the void of a history, they had constructed a tomorrow. She adopted a fresh name, Clara, and eventually she became his spouse. They were content in the subdued manner that folks who anticipate scant from existence can be. 11 months later, their daughter Amelia arrived. As Beatrice narrated, Elias's impassive facade started to fracture. Each phrase was a mallet strike against the brittle casing of optimism he had permitted himself to experience. The woman she depicted, it was Nora. The chronology, the site, the pendant, it was all a flawless, horrific alignment. The earth slanted under Elias's boots. The visages of the crowd smeared into an insignificant mosaic of doubt and intrigue. His wife had endured. She had outlasted the assault he thought had taken her. A ferocious, improbable elation that she had not perished in the mud and turmoil of that day, pursued instantly by a chasm of sorrow so vast it menaced to engulf him entirely. She had endured, but not for him. She had erected a fresh existence, discovered a new affection, and birthed another man's offspring, all while he traversed the wilds, a man wedded solely to her echo. Beatrice's narrative persisted, her voice gentling with a grief of her own. She clarified that a plague had claimed both Clara and her husband 3 seasons ago, leaving Amelia an orphan under her guardianship. The pendant, she admitted, was the sole item Amelia had of her mother's. As she spoke, she remembered a particular she had never comprehended. Her sister-in-law, the woman who named herself Clara, would frequently gaze toward the western ridges for hours, a peculiar, empty expression in her eyes, whistling a tune without lyrics. At times she would sketch marks in the dirt with a branch, designs that appeared to Beatrice like peaks or trails, marks she would hastily obliterate if anyone noticed. Elias identified the portrayal immediately. It was the ballad he had hummed to Eliza. Those were the trail signs of his own kin. Nora's memory had not been wholly absent. It was a captive in her own psyche, a spectre murmuring of a life she could no longer title. The disclosure was absolute, a verity more savage than a claw. His pursuit was concluded, not with a gathering but with a memorial. Eliza. His Eliza was genuinely vanished. Lost to the blaze and malice of that day, Nora had persisted, only to be lost to him anew, this time to a life he never knew and a burial he had never attended. And this child, This pale, terrified girl was not his daughter. She was not the blood of his blood, but she was the final breathing fragment of the woman he had cherished, a breathing resonance of a life robbed from them both. He regarded Amelia, who gazed back at him. Her fright now blended with an emerging bewilderment. She had heard the tale, and though she could not seize its complete significance, she grasped that this odd, silent man was a portion of her mother's concealed chronicle. In her green eyes he saw a mirror of Nora's resilience, and in the resolute angle of her tiny chin he saw a soul that had not yet been fractured by the harshness of the world. The settlers observed, anticipating. The marshal's hand had not shifted. They saw a mountain man, a child and an enigma. They could not witness the fracturing and reforging of a man's whole cosmos. Before him stretched two trails, the known barren path of a man pursued by phantoms, or the uncharted domain of a man obligated to safeguard the living echo of a love he believed was forfeited eternally. In the hush that ensued the tale, every spirit in Frontier Hollow watched to see which path he would select. And then gradually, purposefully, he knelt. The mere act of kneeling broke the strain in the air, substituting it with a deep and disquieting calm. It was not the stance of a trapper, nor the yielding of a prisoner. It was the motion of a man descending to encounter the gaze of a child, a mute recognition of her dread and his own anguish. Amelia, who had been prepared to flee like a startled fawn, found her boots anchored to the earth, her fear briefly overshadowed by a potent, indefinable interest. Marshal Reed's hand, leisurely, nearly unwillingly, drifted from his pistol, though his gaze stayed as sharp and vigilant as an eagle's. The array of settlers started to whisper, their assurance rattled. They had anticipated conflict or menace or a strained confrontation. They did not know how to interpret this hushed exhibition of mourning. Beatrice Brooks, however, comprehended. She perceived beyond the rugged hide and the trapper's frame to the shattered core beneath. In his kneeling shape, she saw a reflection of her own forfeiture, a variant stanza of the same mournful melody. She advanced, shattering the unseen ring of fear around the child, and laid a shaking hand on Amelia's shoulder. Her look met Elias's, and in that glance a delicate armistice was formed. There were a multitude of questions to pose, a lifetime of ache to fathom, but none of it could occur here. In the relentless glare of the communal clearing, with a soft utterance to her niece, Beatrice pivoted and began striding toward her modest cabin at the frosty rim of the settlement, a spot where Frontier Hollow unraveled into the untamed wilds. She did not beckon Elias, not with phrases, but her intentional stride and a lone glance back over her shoulder were an undeniable call. He stood, his motions smooth and hushed, and trailed a courteous span behind. The throng separated for him, their mistrust now mingled with a reluctant reverence. He was infiltrating their realm now, departing the vast slopes for the confined bounds of walls and thresholds. Beatrice's dwelling was compact and battered, but spotlessly tidy. The air within carried the scent of soap, preserved roots, and the persistent aroma of hearthfire. For Elias, who was habituated to the boundless roof of the heavens, the low ceiling felt restricting, the walls a snare. Amelia remained near her aunt, her eyes following his every shift as he positioned himself by the entry, a silhouette of the wild framed against the household domain. Beatrice motioned for him to seat at the small polished oak table, a motion he disregarded, opting to stand where he could view the open terrain. It was a wordless bargaining of limits, a man of the wilds declining to be wholly enclosed by a roof. It was then that Beatrice retrieved a small worn leather pouch. She managed it with veneration, as if it were a sacred artifact. This, she expounded, was all her sister-in-law had with her when she was discovered. It contained the full contents of the existence she couldn't recall. Beatrice unfastened the tie, unveiling a gathering of minor, apparently haphazard items. A oddly formed creek pebble, a quill from a raven, a dried mountain aster, fragile with years, but tucked in a nook wrapped in a bit of worn hide, was a solitary flat stone no larger than his finger. Beatrice acknowledged she never grasped its import, only that Clara would clutch it for hours, smoothing its face until it shone. Elias extended for it, his hand firm despite the quake in his essence. He flipped it. Faintly incised into the stone, nearly unseen to an untrained eye, was the emblem of a twisting trail crossing a summit. It was the token of their union vow, a private oath etched on a stone plucked from the very brook where he had first declared his love to Nora. She hadn't recalled his features or his name or their daughter. But some portion of her, profound in the silent scarred recesses of her spirit, had remembered their pledge. A lone, scorching tear carved a route through the grime on his cheek. This was no longer a random meeting. It was an omen. He was precisely where he was destined to be. The serene instant was disrupted by the sturdy tread of boots on the stoop, followed by a firm tap on the door. Marshall Reed occupied the threshold, his presence draining the coziness from the tiny space. His look absorbed the scene: Beatrice's tear-marked face, the open pouch on the table, and Elias standing like a granite watchman, holding the small etched stone. Reed was not a wicked man, but he was a practical one, accountable for the security of a settlement that perceived threats behind every boulder. He spoke to Beatrice, but his eyes were fixed on Elias. He recognized her tale, which was already disseminating through the settlement like a gale, but clarified that a sorrowful history did not bestow an unrestricted passage. A mountain man on the fringe of the settlement was an ember near dry kindling. He couldn't compel him to depart, not without justification, but he could and would restrain the peril. Reed advanced, his voice subdued and lacking sentiment. He talked of the settlement's own woes. A grizzly bear, aged and sly, had been raiding their stock for weeks, a shade in the crags that no one could pursue. It was bolder now, its takings shifting nearer to the settlement's boundary. "You seek a spot here," the marshal declared, his words a straightforward dare. "Then you'll provide this settlement a motive to desire you. Dwelling on yesterdays won't nourish this child." He glanced from Elias to Amelia, his intent evident. "The settlement proffers a reward for that bear's hide. But you're not a reward seeker. You are a man with the obligation to demonstrate. You will pursue this phantom. You will eliminate the menace it presents to this community. Regard it the cost for our endurance. You triumph, and perhaps we'll view you as something beyond a wraith from a turbulent history. You falter or decline, and this settlement will have no room for you." Elias embraced the marshal's dare with a gradual, intentional inclination. There was no necessity for phrases. The dialect of the pursuit was one he articulated more adeptly than any mortal language. As the sun ascended the following dawn, throwing elongated shades from the settlement's weary structures, he was already vanished, blending into the vista as if he were an element of it. He departed with naught but a blade, a canteen, and the garb on his frame. A sharp disparity to the settlers who had formerly chased the creature with cumbersome shotguns, draft horses, and noisy, awkward resolve. For them, the wilds was a foe to be subdued. For Elias, it was a breathing manuscript, brimming with narratives awaiting interpretation. He did not commence by hunting for the bear's prints. He commenced by heeding. He ascended to a lofty ledge surveying the gorge, his form immobile, his faculties receptive. He heeded the babble of the streams, the course of the breeze, the gentle pulse of existence that saturated the atmosphere. He was seeking a jarring tone, a void of sound where there ought to be noise, for the terror of a mighty predator creates an emptiness in its aftermath. Days morphed into 8. Back in Frontier Hollow, the murmurs began to alter. A local herder, a man named Carson, who had lost 5 head of cattle, had taken to observing Elias from a distance, his telescope aimed at the remote slopes. He recounted what he observed to the men assembled at the tavern. He described how the mountain man seemed to extract moisture from barren stone, how he navigated thick brambly undergrowth without a whisper, how he appeared to interpret the soar of an eagle as if it were a marker. The preliminary chatter of Elias being a charlatan or a hazard gradually yielded to a reluctant admiration. They had regarded the wilds as a crude power. He was demonstrating them it was an entity of complex reasoning. For Elias, this was not a spectacle. It was a reversion to the identity he had been before sorrow had emptied him. Each trace discerned, each animal cry comprehended, was a minor triumph, a reclamation of his own essence. He located the bear's path, not in the soft soil where it was readily concealed, but in the locales others ignored. A lone coarse hair caught on a fir limb, a subtle gouge on a slate outcrop, the unnaturally disrupted arrangement of stones in a parched gully. The path narrated a tale of despair. The takings were haphazard, the motions wasteful. A vigorous bear was a being of graceful, enduring might. This one was otherwise. It was this profound, inherent comprehension of the natural realm, a talent he had always assumed innate, that unraveled the enigma. The settlers saw a fiend, a crafty slayer. Elias saw a beast in torment. He trailed the path not to where a predator would stalk, but to where an injured being would conceal. He searched for protected ledges, concealed seeps, havens of sanctuary. It was there, in a swath of solidified earth near a trickle of bitter water, that he uncovered the verity, an incomplete paw impression, heavier than the rest, and in it the unmistakable stamp of something artificial, a suppurating injury. Later that day, he found the origin, a corroded fragment of an iron snare, long since fractured, resting half interred in the gravel. The bear was not merely aged, it was maimed, its paw distorted by the overlooked brutality of humanity. It was raiding stock, not because it was audacious, but because it was no longer swift enough to chase the wild elk. It was not a sovereign of the heights, but a dethroned ruler, waging a gradual, painful struggle against its own decline. This insight did not diminish his determination, but it transformed its essence. This was no longer a pursuit. It was a compassion. He followed the bear to its ultimate sanctuary, a tight cavern positioned high in a jumble of wind-scoured rocks, a locale that overlooked the whole gorge. The air was motionless and chill, the silence utter. He could detect the illness of the animal, a faint coppery odor on the gust. He readied himself not for a clash, but for a grave, essential deed. He was a trapper, but he was also a component of this terrain, and he grasped the hallowed obligation of terminating suffering. As he advanced silently toward the mouth of the cavern, his blade clutched in his grip. A yell rent the tranquility. "There he is! Pinned it for us!" Elias stiffened. Clambering up the stones behind him were 3 men, their faces reddened with exertion and liquor. Leading them was Buck, a youthful herder whose face was a constant grimace of conceit and bitterness. He had lost more than anyone to the bear and harbored a rotting resentment. They hoisted their shotguns, their actions awkward and boisterous, dispatching a shower of loose rocks cascading down the incline. Buck smirked, a harsh, victorious gleam in his eye as he aimed his shotgun not at the cavern, but at Elias himself. "Well, look at that." Buck's voice resounded in the ravine, oozing with spite. "Took you long enough, or were you two sharing a feast? Step aside, mountain man. This is reckoning for the settlement, and we'll administer it ourselves." The ravine air, once silent, was now dense with the metallic flavor of dread and the rancid stink of cheap spirits. Buck's charge lingered between them, a proclamation of conflict in a place that required absolute quietude. Before Elias could respond, a deep, rumbling snarl echoed from the obscurity of the cavern. It was not a bellow of hostility, but the noise of sheer wretchedness, the complaint of a being in torment being thrust beyond its bounds. The sound dispatched a surge of alarm through Buck's 2 associates, their inebriated audacity dissipating in the stifling cold. One of them, a lad with more recklessness than prudence, discharged his shotgun in a sightless frenzy. The blast veered astray, rebounding off the stone surface with a shrill wail of lead, blanketing the area with shards of rock. That was the ultimate spark. With a thunderous bellow that was more anguish than rage, the grizzly bear erupted from the cavern. It was a horrifying vision, a maelstrom of shaggy pelt, talons and fangs. Its actions rendered frantic and erratic by the twisted paw it could not bear weight on. It was not assaulting to slay. It was a frenzied blind escape for endurance, straight into the course of the men who had ensnared it. Buck, positioned nearest, had only an instant to elevate his shotgun, his face a veil of incredulity and horror. He was the designer of this disorder, and now it was poised to devour him. His associates scrambled rearward, stumbling over one another in their rush to flee. Time appeared to decelerate for Elias. He saw not 3 men and a beast, but a lethal calculation of movement and outcome. He saw Buck immobilized in the path of the pounce. He saw the inescapable result. A man torn, a panicked animal slain, and left to perish a slower, more torturous demise. This was the collapse of raw might, the ungainly waltz of men who brought only clamor and fury into a world that functioned on silence and impulse. In that fraction of a second, Elias acted. He did not unsheathe his blade. He did not holler. He moved like the gale, bridging the distance in 2 mighty bounds. Overlooking the bear, he hurled his whole frame into Buck, a solid and concentrated collision that propelled both of them rolling sideways away from the lethal path. They struck the ground in a knot of arms and legs, tumbling down a brief, steep slope of loose stone and debris, just as the bear streaked through the space where Buck had been positioned. The creature, its desperate flight route now unobstructed, did not halt. It clambered past them, leaving a streak of blood from its injured paw, and vanished into the maze of gorges beyond. The silence that reinstated was denser than before, interrupted only by the irregular alarmed panting of Buck's friends and the gentle slip of displaced stones. Buck reclined on the ground, dazed, the breath expelled from his chest, his shotgun several yards distant. As Elias propelled himself upright, his eyes surveyed the ground where they had plummeted. The impact had dislodged the contents of Buck's pockets and a small hide satchel from his belt. Amid the dispersed shells and a battered tinderbox, a fragment of metal shimmered in the stark sunlight. Elias's eyes contracted. He reached down and retrieved it. It was the other portion of the corroded iron snare. The irregular fracture in the metal was a perfect correspondence to the piece he had found by the seep. The entire sordid narrative snapped into place in his mind with chilling lucidity. Buck was not just the bear's primary casualty, he was its originator. His unlawful, negligently set snare had crippled the animal, transforming a splendid stalker into a desperate forager. Buck's obsessive public loathing was not born of righteous ire, but of the suppurating culpability of a man who had provoked the very issue he couldn't resolve, a secret that had been gradually poisoning him from within. Elias ascended to his feet, the two segments of the broken snare now resting together in his palm. He strode over to Buck, who was just propping up, his face ashen and his conceit demolished. His friends watched, mute, finally grasping they were in the presence of something far beyond their grasp. Elias did not voice a single word of reproach. He did not need to. He simply unfurled his hand, exposing the two pieces of metal that narrated the entire tale. He held Buck's gaze, his eyes not brimming with victory or wrath, but with a profound, weary comprehension. The color ebbed from Buck's face as he stared at the proof of his hidden disgrace, now exposed in the hand of the man who had just preserved his life. Gratitude was an alien territory to a man like Buck, but for the first time, the bravado and fury in his eyes was supplanted by a glimmer of something else, mortification, and beneath it, a sliver of raw, indisputable respect. He averted his eyes from the snare, past Elias, to the vacant gorges where the wounded bear had escaped. The imminent peril was gone, but the genuine problem persisted, now more unstable than ever. His voice, when he finally articulated, was raspy, divested of all its prior spite. "It's still out there," he croaked, glancing back at Elias, injured, deranged. "You know where it'll head now, don't you?" Buck's query lingered in the air, a concession of defeat and an appeal for direction. In that instant, the interplay between the two men and between Elias and the settlement itself shifted like gravel under a stream's flow. There was no more discussion of rewards or reckoning. There was only the somber duty ahead. Elias, with Buck and his subdued friends trailing like reprimanded youths, pursued the bleeding bear. It was not a lengthy trek. As Elias knew it would, the creature had sought a dim, serene place to encounter its conclusion. He entered the final lair solitary, leaving the settlers behind. The noises from within were concise, and the silence that ensued was one of profound conclusiveness. When he surfaced, he bore not a prize, but the burden of a necessary, sorrowful obligation. Their return to Frontier Hollow was subdued. Buck, stripped of his audacity, confessed the truth. He informed Marshal Reed about the unlawful snare, about his foolish arrogance, and about how the mountain man had saved his life from a catastrophe of his own creation. The tale disseminated, not with the velocity of rumor, but with the slow, permeating assurance of a shifting climate. Elias was no longer merely the outsider, the portent. He was the man who had confronted the settlement's beast and displayed more integrity than their own. He had earned not just their endurance, but something far more precious, their admiration. A tranquil cadence settled over the ensuing weeks. Elias did not depart. He established a small, unassuming camp in a grove of aspens on the periphery of Beatrice's land. A silent, vigilant presence. He became a protector for Amelia. He did not attempt to supplant her father, but he became her mentor, unveiling her eyes to the world she had previously only dreaded. He demonstrated how the tiniest print in the snow could narrate the story of a fox's dawn prowl. He instructed her the titles of the peaks, the formations his own forebears used to traverse the immense obscurity. They would sit together for hours, not conversing much but laboring. He taught her to knot sturdy lines from willow bark, to locate springs, to comprehend the dialect of the Gales. For Amelia, a girl who had always been unseen, this concentrated, hushed attention was a potent remedy. She began to bear herself differently, her posture less bowed, a fresh assurance in her gaze. Beatrice would observe them from her stoop, her heart a knot of thankfulness for the mending she was beholding, and sorrow for the existence her sister-in-law Nora had never recalled. A delicate tranquility had descended upon them, the subdued satisfaction of three fractured individuals commencing to form a new configuration together. One twilight, as the sky drained into hues of crimson and indigo, Beatrice retrieved Nora's small leather pouch. She had been watching Elias show Amelia how to spot the night-blooming yucca, which only opened at twilight, and it had evoked a memory. She rummaged through the contents until she located the dried, brittle mountain aster. She informed Elias that Clara had once related a broken tale about that bloom. She couldn't remember who narrated it to her, only that it was about a flower bestowed as a vow that one could discover a haven in the most improbable of locales. A stillness enveloped Elias, so deep it seemed as if the world had ceased revolving. His gaze fastened on the delicate, faded petals. It was not Nora's mother's tale, it was his. He recollected a crisp, windy afternoon years ago, sitting with Nora by a brook. He had plucked an aster just like that one and presented it to her, narrating the tale his own mother had shared with him when their kin had been displaced from their traditional grounds. It was a tale of endurance, of finding a home, not in a locale, but in a sensation, in an individual. In her forgetfulness, Nora had overlooked his features, their existence, even their child. But she had retained his tale. She had borne a fragment of his own legacy within her, and without realizing it had transmitted it to Amelia. The girl was not just the ultimate connection to his wife. She was the unwitting guardian of his own history, a receptacle for a love narrative that had refused to be eradicated. He regarded Amelia, truly regarded her, and saw not a stranger's offspring, but a heritage. This delicate tranquility, this sense of a loop beginning to seal, was fated to be shattered. The calm was ruptured by the frantic, rhythmic thudding of a horse's hooves, expanding swiftly louder. It was not the steady gait of a local horseman. This was the sound of a desperate evasion. A solitary man on a foam-flecked horse erupted into the settlement's main trail, hauling his mount to a sliding stop. He was a scout, his face wan with horror beneath a coating of dirt. He cried of a band of men he'd spied in the Eastern Gap, over 14 of them, riding fierce. They were not herders or troopers. They rode beneath a rough emblem, a ragged black flag displaying the bleached white icon of a wolf's cranium. From his camp, Elias heard the uproar, the scouts' alarmed words reaching him on the twilight zephyr. Every sinew in his body tensed. The wolf cranium, the sign of the raiders, the scattered gang that had long ago exchanged their badges for a standard of sheer outlawry. They were the same men who had torched his cabin, abducted his wife, and slain his past. The tranquility he had just uncovered was a brittle illusion. The phantoms he had carried for so long were no longer recollections. They were galloping on the wind, and they were arriving to complete what they had initiated. The scouts' alert kindled the dry fuel of fear in Frontier Hollow. Panic, unsightly and disorderly, surged through the main trail. Men seized old muskets, yelling conflicting schemes, their fear rendering them clumsy and vociferous. Marshal Reed, his face severe, attempted to enforce order, but he was one man against a flood of dread. This was not a beast in the heights. This was a legion of wraiths, and the settlement was readying for its own interment. It was into this turmoil that Elias strode, emerging from the aspens not as an interloper, but as a stabilizer in a tempest. He moved with a serene, deadly intent that cleaved through the madness. He proceeded directly to Reed, and the men encircling them fell mute, their eyes turning to the mountain man. In his gaze there was no dread, only a chill, concentrated resolve. This was his conflict, a skirmish he had been awaiting without even realizing it. He was no longer a roaming man haunted by the yesterdays. He was a defender of the now, of the small, delicate life he had found with Amelia and Beatrice. His voice when he spoke was low and firm, and it bore an authority that no one dared challenge. He informed them that a defense in the open trail would be a massacre. Their only opportunity was the land itself. He became their tactician, their frontier leader. His knowledge of the topography, once employed for a lone pursuit, was now their singular greatest armament. He guided the handful of capable men, Buck Carson at his flank, his musket gripped with a new solemn determination. Elias had them forsake the exposed settlement hub and instead reinforce the tight gaps and stony bottlenecks in the ravines that offered the only entry to Frontier Hollow. They fashioned rockfalls, hidden musket spots, converting the vista into a sequence of lethal snares while the men prepared for combat. Beatrice led the women and children to the cold, dark hush of a forsaken gold shaft deep in the slopes, a haven of refuge where they would be secure from the blaze and violence to come. Amelia did not wish to abandon Elias's side, her tiny hand clasping his, but he knelt before her and vowed with a look that required no words that he would not permit the phantoms of his history to touch her tomorrow. Then a strained, expectant hush descended. The settlement became a phantom settlement, its protectors concealed in the stones, awaiting the fiend to arrive. They did not await long. The raiders materialized at twilight, a shadowy surge of horsemen against the scarlet horizon, the wolf cranium emblem, a desecration against the firmament. They rode with a strutting assurance, anticipating a rapid and simple pillage. But their initial surge into the primary ravine was met not with alarmed inhabitants, but with an orderly barrage of musket fire from invisible positions. The astonishment was complete, the forefront horsemen tumbling from their saddles. The assured surge degenerated into a perplexed, irate blockade. Yet the raiders were veterans of this brutal labor. They reorganized, and their retaliation was alarmingly accurate. They appeared to know the settlement's arrangement, igniting flames to the stable and the trading post to generate smoke and disorder, their actions implying an eerie familiarity with the terrain. From his outlook, Elias observed their chief, a man who orchestrated the assault with gestures, moving with the seamless poise of a stalker, not an ordinary brigand. As a tongue of fire illuminated the ravine, the chief's face was lit. Elias's blood chilled. It was Lyle, a fellow trapper from the adjacent valley, a man he had known, a man who had disappeared days before the annihilation of his home. The verity hit Elias with the impact of a corporeal strike. Lyle had not been a victim of the gang. He had been their pathfinder. The ruin of his cabin, the loss of Nora and Eliza, had not been a haphazard horror. It had been a treachery from inside. This was not just a struggle for survival. It had become a settling. Lyle's strategies were ingenious and ruthless. He was utilizing his own kin's knowledge of combat against the settlement, outflanking their spots, employing the fire and haze for concealment. The protectors were maintaining, but they were outnumbered and outwitted. The front was starting to crumble. Elias saw a cluster of raiders breach the western gap, heading straight for the slopes that hid the shaft and the people he had vowed to shield. A direct confrontation was forfeited. Time was dwindling. He had to alter the battle itself. He knew Lyle, he knew his vanity, his savagery, and his avarice. But above all, he knew that he, Elias, was the final living witness to Lyle's original transgression. He was the one loose strand. To secure his new existence as a leader of these outlaws, Lyle needed him muted forever. In that moment, Elias made his decision. It was the only one remaining. A offering. He broke from his shelter, clambering up the steep roof of the trading post, the highest point in the settlement. He stood there, outlined against the raging flames, a solitary trapper against the encroaching gloom. He elevated his head to the sky and emitted a battle howl, a sound of pure, unalloyed defiance that he knew Lyle would identify. Below, the disorder wavered. The treacherous scout halted, his head jerking up, a slow, cruel grin of recognition extending across his face. He directed a long, condemning finger straight at Elias, his voice slicing through the clamor as he barked a command to his men. "Forget the settlement. He is the one I desire. Bring him to me breathing." Lyle's command transformed the chaotic incursion into a concentrated manhunt. The raiders, like coyotes scenting gore, abandoned their loot and concentrated on the trading post. For them, Elias was a trapped beast, a trophy to be seized for their chief. But they were profoundly erroneous. Elias was not trapped. He was precisely where he desired to be. He had lured the adversary onto his selected battlefield, a panorama of rooftops, smoke-laden paths, and profound shadows that he understood far better than they did. As the first men scrambled onto the roof after him, he was already vanished, a spectre bounding across the slim chasm to the supply depot, his movements hushed and certain. The settlement of Frontier Hollow once his cage of mistrust, now became his armament. He led them on a lethal pursuit through the night, a wraith that appeared from the haze only to vanish again. He used his knowledge of the settlement's layout, turning every bend into an ambush, every edifice into a potential trap. A line stretched across a dim path sent horsemen tumbling from their mounts. A precisely aimed stone sent an unstably balanced pile of crates crashing down, obstructing a route and sowing confusion. This was not a fight of raw force, but of tactical supremacy. And he was not solitary. The men of the settlement, perceiving his scheme, rallied from their protective positions. Led by Marshal Reed and a grimly resolute Buck, they became the anvil to his mallet. When Elias adeptly herded a small group of raiders into the narrow confines of the stable, Reed's men were there to bar the gates, ensnaring them inside. Buck, using the trailing skills Elias had unwittingly imparted by example, anticipated where an escaping outlaw would go and was there to confront him. It was a harmony of opposition conducted by the mountain man. The settlement's people, who had once been a dispersed collection of fearful souls, were now a unified combating force, joined by the man they had once avoided. One by one, the raiders were seized, disarmed, or sent fleeing into the wilds, their numbers and their assurance crumbling under the unyielding, intelligent pressure. Finally, only one true menace remained. Lyle, his face a veil of fury at his men's ineptitude, dismounted and drew a long, sinister-looking hatchet, his eyes scanning the shadows for Elias. He would conclude this himself. Elias, observing from the shadows of the post, knew this was the finale. He permitted Lyle to glimpse him, a transient sight that drew the betrayer into the vast, dim interior of the trading post. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pitch smoke and heated iron. The only illumination came from the waning amber glow of the massive stove. Lyle entered, haughty and assured of his triumph in a close-quarters brawl. He pounced, his hatchet glinting in the faint light. But Elias did not meet power with power. He met it with sagacity. He used the post itself, its dangling ropes, its heavy crates, its cluttered areas to dodge and redirect, turning Lyle's superior vigor into a clumsy burden. Lyle grew incensed, his movements becoming more heedless. He taunted Elias as they clashed, his words dripping with venom. He spoke of how he had watched Elias's cabin blaze, how he had taken the gang's coin, how frailty was the only true fault. He finally spied an opening, pinning Elias against the great iron stove, and pounced forward for the fatal strike. In that ultimate, desperate instant, Elias did not raise his blade to parry. He sidestepped, and with a mighty thrust, threw his weight against the long iron handle of the post's great bellows. The apparatus designed to feed a gust of air to the fire responded with a deep, groaning bellow. But instead of air, it was a massive plume of superheated cinders, soot and glowing coals that burst from the stove, blasting directly into Lyle's face. He shrieked, a sound of pure torment, dropping his hatchet as he clawed at his eyes, utterly blinded. His forward impetus meant to kill was now his ruin. He staggered sightlessly, crashing into a heavy wooden rack of stored tools and pelts, which toppled over and pinned him to the ground. A captive of the very materials he had intended to dominate, Elias had not vanquished him with a weapon, but with an implement. He had used the core of the settlement's trade, the emblem of its endurance, to neutralize the threat. The clash was over. As Reed and Buck rushed in to secure the writhing, sightless betrayer, a weighty silence descended. The immediate peril had passed, but as they bound Lyle's hands, he turned his blind face towards Elias, a poisonous sneer on his lips. "This alters nothing," he rasped, his voice a low snarl. "They compensated me handsomely to locate you. The first time was for your territory. This time it was for you, and they are still searching." A cold apprehension settled in the air. The battle for Frontier Hollow was victorious, but Lyle was only an indication. The true affliction, a nameless foe from Elias's history, was still out there. The fires of the incursion eventually extinguished, and in their stead, a new kind of warmth enveloped Frontier Hollow. The months that ensued were a period of restoration, not just for the settlement's scorched cabins, but for its injured essence. Autumn arrived, and with it, the forests flamed in a defiant burst of hues, a pledge that life always discovers a path. The settlement reconstructed, but differently. The aura of mistrust was absent, replaced by a communal aim. Men who had once glared at each other over fence lines now labored side by side, erecting the new frame of the trading post. And at the heart of this revival was Elias. He was no longer the apparition at the rim of the settlement. He was its quiet, steadfast core. He had constructed a small, robust lodge for himself near Beatrice's home, its beams solid and grounded, a testament to his resolve to remain. A new, serene routine settled upon their small, improbable kin. Mornings were for teachings. He would instruct Amelia the timeless craft of forging, his large scarred hands directing her small ones as she learned to shape scrap metal into the forms of forest creatures. In the afternoons, their roles would invert. Amelia, with a patient resolve that reminded him so much of Nora, would teach him to read from a tattered tome of frontier legends, her tiny finger tracing the odd black marks that were as alien to him as the summits were to her. Beatrice would watch them from the stoop, a gentle smile on her face, knowing she was witnessing the repairing of 3 broken souls into a single, sturdier whole. The menace that Lyle had mentioned lingered, a remote cloud on the horizon of their newfound tranquility, but it was a fear for tomorrow, not for today. Today was for the aroma of fresh-hewn cedar, for the sound of a child's mirth, for the quiet solace of affiliation. One day Marshal Reed came to call, not with a caution but with a conundrum. After Lyle and his men had been delivered to the lawman, their belongings had been examined. Among the betrayer's possessions was a roughly sketched chart, which the marshal now unfurled on the table before Elias. It depicted the area, marking his raised cabin with an X and Frontier Hollow with a ring. But there was a third notation, a site deep in the northern ranges, labelled only as the Origin. It was what was illustrated beside this third site that made Elias's breath snag in his throat. It was a bear in the same unique charging style as the one on the pendants, and beside it, a name, Thorn. It was not his name, nor Nora's. It was the name of his great-uncle, a legendary frontiersman spoken of in yarns, heir of explorers who had vanished from the world 1 generation ago. The ultimate piece of the enigma dropped into place, re-illuminating his entire odyssey. The assault on his cabin had not just been for territory. Lyle had been employed not just to find a random mountain survivor, but to hunt the last known scion of Thorn. Elias was not merely a trapper who had lost his kin. He was the bearer of a potent and revered lineage, an inheritance he never knew he held. His roaming had not been purposeless. It had been a subconscious voyage back to a fate that had been awaiting him all along. The pendant he had forged was more than a father's offering. It was a resonance of his ancestry, a symbol of a grand heritage that had refused to be quenched. He looked at Amelia, who was now carefully hammering a claw onto a small metal wolf, and he understood. His purpose was not just to protect this child, who was the daughter of his heart, but to guard the future of a bloodline that had survived Blaze, betrayal, and Eros. The sun began to dip, casting an amber light over their small dwelling. A sense of profound tranquility settled over Elias. A tranquility deeper than the mere lack of strife. His long search for Eliza was concluded. His quest for retribution was insignificant. He had been a wraith, haunted by a history he could not alter. But here, in this frosty settlement that had once dreaded him, he had found a new existence. The narrator would say that redemption is not always found in reclaiming what was lost. Sometimes it is found in the bravery to build something new upon the remnants. It is in the discovery that family is not a matter of blood alone, but of ties forged in the fires of hardship and sealed with unswerving devotion. And that home, the one true home, is not a place on a map, but a feeling of security in the hearts of those you would lay down your life to defend. The future was uncertain. The whispers of a distant foe, a reminder that the world was still a perilous place. But for now, a trapper had found his calling. A child had found her kin. And in an overlooked nook of the vast and unforgiving frontier, a home had been forged. Did you enjoy this journey? Let us know what part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment. And to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.